The next part of this video, we are talking about something called the DOM, and that stands for Document Object Model, and it's very closely related to HTML, which we talked about in the previous part of this lesson. Now, I will say, if you have not completed the challenge that I gave in the prior video, go ahead and complete that, and I would recommend that you have at least a basic understanding of HTML and kind of understand how to put something together within, a Codepen document or something like that. Because if you don't have at least a basic level of understanding of HTML, this stuff is not going to make any sense. Before we get into this, I want to show you a little bit about the Codepen environment so that we can understand how do we actually debug JavaScript within the browser and take those concepts we've been looking at in the prior videos where we've pretty much right clicked. So let's take a look at the screen here. If we right click and inspect and then we come to the console, then we can write basic JavaScript within the console. So we've been working in the console quite a bit, but when we go to Codepen, since it's kind of its own environment, we have to do a few things to make sure that console is working the same. So if we come down to the JS section of the Codepen, this is a little bit different than what we've been working with in the console. Now, if we were to just type something like, console.log hello, now this is going to be printed to the console, but it's going to do it over and over again every time the page loads, because this JavaScript that we're working with here is directly connected to the HTML document above. So it's not really like a free-form console that we can use to test out different JavaScript. Now, Codepen does have a console down here at the bottom left, and if you open it up, you'll see that we have that hello that we printed by writing that JavaScript code, but we can also do something like that down here in the console, and this is supposed to represent the same type of thing that we've been working with when we right-click and inspect and go to the DevTools console. But the problem is this is not a really nice and easy console to work with. Like if you started to, define a variable that's like a string or something, and then you type A and you hit enter, it's not going to be defined. And that's a problem because we want to be able to experiment around and work with our JavaScript as we're building it. So to solve that problem, we're not going to be using the Codepen console. What we're going to do is right-click and inspect within the Codepen document, so it still opens up this console. And I will note I'm in Google Chrome, not Firefox. This does not work quite as well in Firefox, unfortunately. So I've switched to Chrome for that reason. And if we go to the console, you'll see some of the hellos that we put there from earlier. But if you go to this little drop down here, when we first enter the document, you might see something like top. But in order to get the right context to work in, you have to drop this down and scroll down to Codepen. Now we can actually select elements from the Codepen document that we've written here, and we don't have to, we're basically going to have some responsiveness with our JavaScript. Just to quickly show you this, and we're going to cover all of this stuff in a little bit, but let me put a basic paragraph tag in our Codepen document, and you can see it showing up there. And if we have this context, the JavaScript context set to top, and we try to type document.query selector and then grab all the paragraph tags, it's not going to grab us the right ones. So this is a paragraph tag, but it's not the one that we're looking for here. So we have to go down to the right context, so select Codepen, and now when we run this, it should give us the correct element that we're looking for. So that's just really important. If you're trying to follow along with this, like code along as I'm doing it, just make sure that you're in Google Chrome, you right-click, inspect element, and make sure that the context is the right one. It's under the Codepen context. All right, now we got that covered. Just want to make sure that you're able to follow along. Let's jump into what the document object model, or the DOM, is all about. Now, how I would describe the DOM is a bridge between HTML and JavaScript. Prior to these lessons, we've been going through how to write JavaScript code. We've gone through all the basics of it, so you have at least a basic level of understanding of how to write JavaScript. We also just learned about the basics of HTML, which, as you saw, is a lot easier to learn than JavaScript. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take these two concepts and we're going to combine them together to make our HTML come alive. So remember with the house analogy, HTML is the structure, CSS is the styling, and JavaScript is the function. So in other words, with the house analogy, HTML is the bricks and the concrete and the wood, the CSS is the paint on the house, and the JavaScript is going to be the plumbing and the electric and all that kind of stuff. Now the first question you're going to ask is, why are we looking at the DOM in the first place? How do we know that this is important? Well, the DOM is basically at the root of any front-end framework that you're ever going to work in. It's the only way that we can connect our JavaScript to HTML, and while you may not see it directly, it may kind of be doing a bunch of stuff behind the scenes when you're working with a framework like Angular, React, or Vue.js. It's still there. It's still using the DOM API. We're going to talk about that in a second. So it's important to know that it exists and know the basics of how it works and what it's trying to accomplish. So what is the DOM? Now we know it's the document object model, which gives us a little bit of a clue what we're talking about here, but it's a little bit more complex than just that. Now I'll start with what it is not. So the DOM is not a programming language. It's also not natively part of JavaScript. So it only exists within the browser, and there's different browser implementations, whether you're on Firefox or Chrome or Safari. They all have slightly different implementations of the DOM. For our intents and purposes, we don't really care about those differences. We just want to know, what it is and how it works. So the best way to think about the DOM is an API for an HTML document. Now you may not know what an API is, but luckily I have done a video on just that. So go ahead and watch that if you're unclear of what an API is. But just as a 10,000 foot view, what I consider an API, and this is my personal definition of it that makes sense in my head, is a software API can be thought of as a user manual that allows developers to do something useful with a third-party software or hardware without knowing the inner workings of that software or hardware. So basically, the API that we call the DOM is going to allow us to manipulate HTML without knowing, how is HTML actually, manipulated within the browser. All we have to know is how to write the HTML and then how to use the API that we call the DOM to manipulate it. I know your head's probably spinning at this point, so let's jump into a simple example to understand what I'm talking about. So what I'm going to do here is paste in some HTML, all right? So this is going to be a basic HTML document. I've got an H2 tag, a paragraph tag, and a button. Now, if we click this button, and we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, when we click this button, it's not going to do anything. And the reason is we don't have any JavaScript connected up to it. In order to connect it up, all we have to do is first identify the element that we're wanting to make interactive, and then once we identify it, we need to instruct it to do something via JavaScript. So just as an example, we can identify this button using pure JavaScript. And all we have to do is type document.querySelector, and then we type in button because that's the tag that we're looking for. Now, of course, I need to select the correct context to work in. So we want the Codepen context. And then from here, when we press enter, we're going to see the button that is within our Codepen output. All right, so that's how we would select that button. Now, from there, we can actually store that within a variable. So if we were to rewrite that command and then just store it in a basic variable, so btn is our variable, now we can reuse it and we can do things with it. But at this point, you probably don't have any clue what all of these commands are, like what is document here, what's query selector, all of that kind of stuff. Doesn't make any sense yet because we haven't talked about the DOM. So to better understand it, I want to bring in yet another analogy for us. Now, when we think about an HTML document, just a static HTML document that we've been working with so far, so this one right here on the screen, that is kind of the equivalent to a paper map. So with a paper map, there's only so many things you can do with it. You can write on it, of course, but you're not going to be able to, click into it and see some more details about it. But we can do that with something like Google Maps. We can click in and go to different places and do a bunch of other functions with it. So the analogy here is that HTML alone is like a paper map, but when we add the DOM API with that HTML, then it becomes something like Google Maps, where we have a lot of interactivity that we can put into it. So to really talk about the document object model, let's take a look from 10,000 feet. All right, so we know some things about JavaScript that are pretty familiar to us. So for example, this is a string in JavaScript. We know that, all right? And we also know that this is going to be a number, all right? But what about that button that we just defined here? So we saved it into the button variable. So if we look at that variable, what type of data is that? Well, we don't actually have a good indication of that. All we have to do is say type of button, and it's going to say object. Well, clearly there's got to be something more specific than just object. And there is when we start using the DOM or document object model terminology. From the DOM's perspective, this element right here, or this variable right here, is considered an element. So if we were to come to the document object model documentation here, you're going to see all sorts of interfaces and stuff. It's a pretty complex API that we're not going to even cover half of. But if we click in and look at the element, this is the most general base class from which all element objects in a document inherit. All right, so that would be what we are looking at when we have saved that selected element into a variable called btn. And once we know that this is of this element type, we can come here in the documentation, we can see there's all sorts of properties that we can look at, and there's all sorts of methods that we can use on this specific variable. So we have a lot of functionality available to us, but we have to first understand, the whole 10,000 foot view. So what I'm going to do in order for us to understand it better is show you a picture that's going to represent what the DOM is really trying to do. So at its highest level, the DOM has two built-in objects that are probably going to be used more than any other objects that you look at. So at the top level, the very top level, you have the window object. And what you can think of that as is literally the browser window that we're working in. More specifically, it's kind of referring to the individual browser tab that we're working in, but in some cases it can cross over between tabs. So you can actually program using that one object. You can do all sorts of things within a browser. So as a general user of a web browser, there are several things that you do every day that you don't realize are programmable. So one of those things is scrolling down, all right? Scrolling down or scrolling up. Every time you scroll, you can actually do that programmatically with JavaScript. Now, another thing you can do is you can resize the browser window. So if you were to resize it like this, you can actually do that with JavaScript. All right, and finally, if you refresh the page, that's also something you can do with JavaScript. And the way that you do it is by connecting in to the DOM via that top level object that we call window. All right, so I'm going to quickly show you how we can programmatically do these things by using that object. But first, let's take a look at this in the MDN documentation. So we'll search for window, and here's what we're looking for. And it says the window interface represents a window containing a DOM document. The document property points to the DOM document loaded in that window. So basically it's saying that the window's the browser itself, or the tab, and then there's an HTML document represented by the document object within it. All right, so that picture that I just showed you kind of shows that relationship, how we have a HTML document that we are putting in that browser window. Now from here, this window object, like I said, has all sorts of properties and methods that we can use to do things that we commonly do just by clicking around in the browser on a normal basis. So you can see down this left-hand side, these are all of the different things we can do with it. So for example, we have this alert method. So let's go ahead and inspect element. So we're in the browser console, and if we type window.alert and then we say I love programming or something like that and press enter, it's going to open up an alert window. And you can see how we're already starting to program this browser window using that object. Here's another thing we can do. We can open up new tabs. So if we say window.open and maybe go to Google, all right? When we press enter, it's going to open a new tab and put us at google.com. So that's pretty cool. Let's see, another thing that we can do is we can scroll. So you have to obviously be on a page that has a scroll bar, which this one does. And from here, we just say window scroll by, and then we give it a bunch of options here. These are all documented within this method. So if you were to go down to the methods of window, let's see if we can find them. All right, so we found the methods here, and let's see if we can find this scroll by method. All right, so we have scroll by, we can click on that, and it just tells us, okay, you can pass in some options here. And those options that we're passing in are scroll to options, all right? And then from here, we have the top, left, and behavior. So we're gonna define, we wanna scroll from the top, we wanna scroll window.innerHeight, which is going to be a built-in property of that window object, which basically says, here's how tall this entire HTML document is. All right, so from the top, we want to scroll down the entire length of the page. Essentially, we're going to the bottom of this page. All right, and then from the left, we want 0. We don't want to scroll left and right. And the behavior that we want is going to be smooth. We don't want to just jolt down the page. We want to smoothly scroll. All right, so when we do this and close out this method and press enter, you got to watch the screen now. It's going to scroll all the way down to the bottom of this, page or whatever. And I guess it didn't go all the way down because I actually explained that wrong. So window.innerHeight, if we look at that, inner height is only going to define how large the visible window is. So it's not going to define how large the entire document is. So obviously this is a much larger document. So it's only going to scroll down one entire page. And then finally, we are able to actually reload the page. So we can tap into the window.location property, and then that location property has a method called reload. And you could have found this in the documentation if you looked hard enough, but I don't want to right now just for sake of time. So let's press enter, and you can see, you may not have seen it, but it reloaded the entire page programmatically. So you can see how that top level window object is basically our control over the browser. And the way that this is happening is via the DOM API. So the DOM, again, is just an API to connect in with our browser in an HTML document. Now, another thing to mention about this is it's a global object, which means we don't have to actually specify it every time we use it. So I showed you before that we could do window.alert and then type in something to get an alert. All right, so we can also do this by dropping window. Like, we don't even need that because it's global, and we can go ahead and get the same results there. All right, so that's important to keep in mind with the window object and the document object. These are both global, so we don't need to specify them before calling their methods or properties. So a couple common properties on window. We're not going to go through all of the methods and properties for all of these objects, but this is just such a high level one, an important one, that I want to. So window has a few common properties that you might want to tap into. One of those is going to be the inner height, and I spelled that wrong, so it's not going to give me anything. So we've got inner height is going to give us the height in pixels of the space that displays the HTML. So the visible area that's displaying that HTML. Now, if we said outer height, that's going to give us the pixel height of the entire browser window. So if you look at this value, it's 1040, but if you make this browser window smaller and you say outer height, it's going to give us a different value, 894. The same thing applies for inner width and outer width. So inner width is going to give you the width of this space that's displaying the HTML. So if you resized this, you're going to get a different inner width. All right, so I don't want to spend too much time on the properties, but you can kind of get the gist of what that's showing you. Now, another common property that we might look at here with window is going to be local storage. All right, so this is going to be a big one that will come up as we start getting into more advanced web development concepts. And basically what this allows you to do is store data temporarily in the browser. So if I were to go to the application here in Chrome, it's called a little bit different thing in Firefox. I actually talked about that in like the third lesson of this series. But if you click here, you can actually see key value data pairs that can be set and retrieved through the local storage object. So if we wanted to set an item, we'll just say test, and then we want to set it equal to 20. We can do that, and then we come to application, and you can see test has a value of 20 here. So it's a great way to store temporary values, and that is accessed through the local storage object that sits on the window object. All right, and then finally, I want to talk about the location because this is going to basically represent an object that has details about where you're visiting right now. So right now we're on the MDN web docs, and if we were to look at the window.location, you're going to get all sorts of details about that location we have in the address bar. So these are some of the common properties. Just one more, two more that I want to show you here before we move on. Window has a scroll X property, which is going to indicate how much we have scrolled from the left side of the page, or I guess right and left horizontal scrolling. And then we have window.scrollY, which is going to indicate how much we've scrolled up and down. So you see the scroll bar here. This is going to change the value of this property every time we scroll a little bit. So these are all going to come in handy as we work with the DOM later on, and we want to programmatically do things within this browser window. Now, I've briefly mentioned it before, but we can have these things called events happening within the DOM. Now, this is going to be a little bit complicated, but I want to just show you a basic example of this. Something that you can do on the top level window object. So we can say window on scroll. So basically we're saying we want to tap into the on scroll event, which basically every time I move that browser scroll bar, it's going to fire this event. And what I want to do every time I scroll, I want to execute a function. So right here I'm using an anonymous function, and I'm just going to console.log hi. All right, so something very simple. And now we have set an event listener on the entire window. All right, so now when I touch this scroll bar, we're going to get this printing hi to the console for a lot of different iterations here. So that's just a basic event. Now, I just want you to know that that is available and it's something that you can do, but we're not going to really dig into the super nitty-gritty details of it in this lesson. All right, so now that we've talked about the window object, which represents the entire tab that we have open, or I guess the browser that we're working in, let's talk about the document object. So let's put that back up on the screen, that 10,000 foot view of the DOM API. We've got at the top, we've got the window object, and then a property of the window object is going to be document. And this is where the real fun begins, because document is basically a representation of your entire HTML document that you've written. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to refresh the browser so we don't have that on scroll event firing every time. But we have window at the top, and then we have this property called document. All right, so we press enter on this, and you now see that we have this big object that has basically the HTML document defined within it. And while we can expand these different things visually within the console, there's actually a lot of things that we can do programmatically using this document object. We can add or remove HTML elements from the existing page. We can modify existing HTML elements, and we can even set events on specific HTML elements. We saw how we set an event on the entire window, but we could set an event like we talked about earlier in the prior video, something like that, where we have a button and we want to wait for a click event, and we want to fire some sort of function that does something every time that button is clicked. So this document object is very powerful, and there's a lot of things that we have to cover to understand what it actually does. So let me show you a basic example of this. We'll go back over to our Codepen, which we have a basic HTML document here, and I'm going to type document, and let's take a look at what we're dealing with. So right here we have this top level HTML wrapper, which we talked about is going to happen for every single HTML document. In Codepen, you'll notice over here we don't have that written, but Codepen is automatically wrapping our HTML within the HTML wrapper. All right, so we expand this down. We have a head, Codepen takes care of this, and a body. And then from here, this is where the actual HTML and JavaScript that we're writing is going to be placed. So you'll see that we have our H2 element, our paragraph element, and our button element. And then you also see some scripts down here at the bottom. And basically these scripts are what are represented here in the JavaScript. So any JavaScript we type here is connected up to our HTML document via these script tags. So again, don't have to understand how that all works. We'll get into that in future lessons, but I just wanted to show you the anatomy of this document object. Now, if you've been following this series all the way through and you went through the JavaScript series, you know how to write basic JavaScript, and you also know that if we have a JavaScript object, we can access properties of it. So let's define a basic object with a property, all right, something like prop1 and prop2. Nothing fancy here. But if we were to, or actually let's make a nested object as well. We'll say nested right here, and then we will end this. All right, so object.prop2.nested is going to equal our value right here because we use the dot notation to access the different embedded properties and values within this object. Now, you would think that we could do the same thing with the document object, but we can't. All right, so if we try to do the same sort of access, let's clear the screen, and if we try document, and then let's go ahead and look at it one quick second. So we obviously have document, then we have HTML, then we have body. So if we typed document.html.body, it's going to say we cannot read the property of body because it's undefined. So we clearly cannot just access these different HTML elements with dot notation. We have to use the document object model API to do so. And it's a little bit different, it takes a little bit of getting used to, but hopefully we can walk through some of the more common ways to use it here in the remainder of this video. So I'm going to put on a new HTML document here with some additional parts to it so that we can really visualize what this DOM is all about. All right, so we can think of the document object model as a tree. And furthermore, we can think of this tree as kind of like we think about ancestry trees or whatever, where you have grandparents and then you have parents and you have children and stuff like that. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is this HTML document that we just created in this Codepen represented as the DOM tree. All right, so you can see that we have the document at the top, then we go down to HTML, and then from there we have the head and the body, and underneath the body specifically, we have all of this HTML that we have written here. And within that HTML, we have a lot of siblings, but we also have some children. So for example, let's look at this main div right here for the main body. So the main body div is going to be the parent to this H1 tag, these two P tags, and this UL or unordered list tag. All right, so that's going to be the parent to these four. Now, if we look at the list items, its parent is going to be the unordered list, and its grandparent is going to be the main body div. So you can see how these relationships start to build. And furthermore, we have, the concept of siblings. So all of these list items, these are all going to be siblings within the document object model. And this unordered list, the p tags, and the h1, they're all siblings. So what do we call all of these elements? Well, in the document object model, we call them all nodes. Now this is very different. You should not confuse this with Node.js. We'll talk about that later in the series, but that's basically the back-end server-side version of writing JavaScript. This is a totally different concept. All of these elements are considered nodes within the DOM tree. Now, of course, they're all different, so they're all different types of nodes. And I'm going to put the image back on the screen that we looked at in the prior part of this lesson when we talked about the basics of HTML. So within this element that we have defined, it's a total unit, we have different types of nodes here. So at the simplest level, we have something called an element node, and that's going to be represented by the p tag. All right, and then we have an attribute on that HTML element, and we call that an attribute node. And then finally, we have a text node, which is going to be the content that we're putting between the starting and closing paragraph tags. Now, to prove this out to you, I'm going to actually take this element and create it in JavaScript and then insert it into the page that we're looking at right here. All right, so the first thing we have to do is define each of those three different types of nodes. All right, so the first one is going to be an element node. And let me actually zoom out a little bit here. So we've got an element node, and we have to use the document object, and then we use create element. And before we do that, I keep forgetting, we have to change the context to Codepen so that we're working with the document that we're seeing over here rather than the whole document. All right, so sorry about that. And what we're going to do is create our element node, which is going to be a p tag. All right, so we're just creating that element we just put on the screen. So let's press enter, and we have created our first element node. And if we look at that, it's just going to be an empty p tag. There's nothing in it yet. All right, so now we have to create our text node. All right, so we're going to type document.create text node. And then here we're going to put in the word content, which is the stuff that was between the p tags. All right, so we press enter, and right now this element node is still empty. All right, so we still have an empty p tag, and the reason is we haven't assigned the text node to that element yet. Before we do that, let's create our last node, which is going to be an attribute node. So we'll create an attribute, and we want to call this a class attribute because that's the type of attribute we had on this HTML element. All right, so at this point, let's look at what we have here. So we have element node, which is a empty p tag. Then we have the text node, which is going to be content as a string, or more specifically a DOM string. And then finally, we have our attribute node, which is going to be class equals to empty. So basically, we haven't assigned a value to this attribute yet, but we've initialized it. The first thing I want to do is I want to take our text node and I want to put it inside our p tag or element node. So all we have to do is say element node.append child, and then we pass in the text node, press enter, and now when we print out the element node, it's going to be a p tag with that content placed between it. Now we are starting to build out this element. The next thing that we have to do is give a value to our attribute. So if you saw before, we have class equal to an empty string. All we have to do that is we say attribute node, and then we say .value equals some class. All right. So now we have this attribute node. If we print that, it's going to say class equals some class. So we're getting closer. The only thing that we are missing is this attribute is not connected up with our paragraph element. So to do that, all we have to do is take our element node and we say set attribute, and then we pass in the attribute node, and it says it failed to execute because there are two. Oh, okay, I messed it up. So not set attribute, we have to set attribute node. All right, so we press enter there, and now the element node is going to be our full HTML element that we saw in the model before. The last thing we have to do is insert it into the document. And the way that we do that is we use the document object, so we type document, and then we use the append child method. We haven't talked about this yet, but I just want to show how it works. And now we just pass in element node, and if you look at the bottom of our Codepen, you're going to see this element inserted into the document. And it's going to say it failed to execute because I messed up once again. I forgot I need to add one more piece of code in here. I need to say document.body. So instead of just inserting it at the end of the document, which represents the whole HTML document, I need to specify that I want to look at the body specifically. So if we go over to elements and we look at the entire, well, I guess this is not a good example because Codepen is adding a bunch of other stuff. But basically, we need to put in the body element. So let's press enter, and you can now see that our content has been inserted into our existing HTML document. So you may not have recognized it, but we're actually tapping into the DOM's API to do everything we just did. We created a new HTML element with JavaScript alone. And you can see that we use things like set attribute node and append child. And we've used create attribute, create text node, create element. These are all methods that are defined within the document object model. All right, so we are actually using the DOM as we speak here. Now, you might ask, what's the point of this? Every time we refresh the page, so if we refresh this page, reload it, we're not going to have those same elements inserted into our document anymore. And I'm not sure what I'm doing here. Okay, so HTML, I actually need to copy in some stuff here. It's because I didn't save the actual Codepen. But whatever the case, that content at the bottom is going to be temporary. And you might ask, well, what's the point of inserting stuff with JavaScript? And the answer to that is for user experience. So when a user creates a calendar event on Google Calendar, you'll see a calendar event pop up immediately on that calendar. And that was done via JavaScript, tapping into the DOM. All right, another example is a user adds a to-do item to their to-do app, or a user creates a post on Facebook. All of these things are using JavaScript via the DOM, so the DOM's API, to insert elements and modify elements that are existing within the HTML document. But they're only temporary, and it's because we want a better user experience. So we want to immediately change that, web page, and then later we kind of save that to the database and reload it with new data later. All right, so at this point, we have gone through a lot of different angles to think about the DOM with, but we haven't actually, buckled down and tried to understand, how do we actually use the DOM here? What are some of the methods available to us? What exactly is the DOM? We've been working with the window object and the document object, but there's so much more to it. We can also work with individual elements, and with each element, we can do certain things with that. Just like we talked about with HTML and JavaScript before, the purpose of this series is not to make you an expert in any one thing. It's to take you from zero to launching your first full stack application and deploying it. So we got to cover a lot of ground. So I'm going to walk you through an example of using the DOM. We're going to cover some of the common methods and properties that we can use within the DOM, but we're not going to cover everything. And quite frankly, most developers don't know everything about the DOM. It's very complicated, and there's a lot of stuff that you will never end up using within your career. Anyways, let's get started. Let's go ahead and put some new HTML in our Codepen. All right, and this one says, welcome to my HTML tutorial. Click the button below to begin. And this button, what we want to do with this is every time we click it, we want to add a new paragraph element to the bottom of this page. So how do we do that? Well, it's 3 steps. Number 1, we have to find a way to identify the button element so that we can start working with it. Number 2, we have to register a click event on this button, which is part of the DOM. It's part of the DOM API. And then number 3, we need to write a function that will insert a new paragraph element in the web page every time we click it. So let's take a look at our button here. We have a global attribute called ID. Every HTML element is able to have this ID attribute. And we also have a global attribute called class. Every HTML element is eligible to have a class on it. So we have multiple ways to identify this button. So let me take you through a couple of those ways to better explain some of the methods we have on the DOM. Here's the first way we can do it, and this is probably the most generic. We can say document.querySelector, and then we can just type in button, because this is going to be, button is going to represent the tag that we're looking for. So what this is going to do right now is it's going to look for any button on the entire page here, including Codepen's interface. And the reason is we don't have the right context. So let's go down to Codepen again and try this again. So we're going to select button, and what this is going to do is it's going to look through the HTML document that we're working with, and it's going to find the first occurrence of a button tag. And if it doesn't find it, it's just going to return null. Now the question is, how did I know to use this document.querySelector? All right, the reason I knew that is because if you go to the documentation, you go to APIs/DOM, then you go down to DOM, and you find that document object. So this is that document object that we talked about. It represents the HTML document itself. This has certain properties and it has certain methods that are available for us to use. So if we scroll down all the way to the methods, you will see a couple of different query methods. So we have query command enabled. You won't use that much. Couple others, but you can see query selector. It's actually listed twice. I'm not sure if that's meant to be that way. I don't think it is actually, but we can go to query selector, and this will tell us basically how to use it. So we can put in selectors. It says a DOM string containing one or more selectors to match. This string must be valid. CSS selector string. So we don't know a whole lot about CSS quite yet, but basically what that means is if we pass in to this query selector, if we pass in something with a hashtag at the beginning, that represents an ID. So if you remember, we've got this ID equal to btn-1. So if we put the hashtag and type btn-1, we should be able to find this element again. Of course, we got to go back to the Codepen context. It's very annoying that I have to do that, but I promise it'll get a little bit easier in the future. So we'll go btn-1, and we can find that element that way. Now we can also use a class selector, which is a period. All right, so you can see our class is my-btn. So if we do period my-btn, we should be able to find the same button that way as well. And these are just more specific ways to find a single element within the DOM. Now, of course, as with anything in programming, there's lots of ways to solve the same problem. And if we go back to this documentation, let's go back to the main document object. And if we look at some of the methods here, we've got these query selectors, which are kind of generic query selectors that it's all I use to find elements within the HTML document. But you can also get an element by ID. All right, so that's another way to locate an element. So if we were to replace this, so we say get element by ID, and then this time all we have to do is pass in the ID. You don't even need a hashtag at the end. Oh, I messed this up here. All right, let's try that again. So get element by ID and button 1, and we should be able to find that button once again by using a different method. So as you can see, there's many ways to skin a cat here, and with the document object model, you can get very creative with your code. Now, the reason that selecting it by an ID is the most specific way to do it, and probably the best way to do this, is because you cannot have two elements with the same ID. So if I tried to copy this button down here, and it's got the same exact ID as the other button, it's going to have a conflict. So this is not really valid HTML. It'll still render, but it will cause you problems if you're trying to use any sort of front-end framework or even locate things with the DOM. So what I'm going to do here is paste in all of the different ways we can identify this one button. Let me get rid of the button here, the second one, and then it's going to kind of refresh, put me back in the wrong context, so I'm going to go back. And now if I paste in all of these different methods, so you can see there's quite a lot of different ways to identify this button, but these are all valid ways to do it. And this only executed, it looks like one of them, but if you were to type each of these in individually, it's going to locate it each time. But obviously there are some that are more specific than others, and we always prefer to be as specific as possible when identifying elements within the DOM. Alright, so now that we know how to identify this element, let's go ahead and write that in our code. So far we haven't used this JavaScript section quite yet, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to say add paragraph, and we're going to make a function that's going to be actually called every time we click that button. So from here, all we have to do is locate the button and assign it to a variable. So we're going to use one of those methods. I just will choose the query selector, and we're going to pass in the ID of that button in order to identify it. All right, so this button variable should represent our button, and from here, we should be able to do something with it every time it is clicked. And I'm actually going to not put this within the function. This will just be in the global scope of our JavaScript document here. I'm going to close out this console so that we have some more room to write just for a second. All right, so now we have this button being identified, and then we have a function that's going to add a paragraph. All right, and the last thing that we have to do is we have to add an event listener. So this is how we do that. We just say add event listener, and then we specify the event that we're trying to listen to, and then the function or the callback that we're going to pass in to execute on that event happening. Now this is the first way to register an event on a specific HTML element. This is one way to do it. Another way to do it is if we take our element, button, and then we say on click, and then we set it equal to add paragraph, then that's going to also register that event on the button. And then a third way we can do it is in the HTML itself, and this is what we looked at previously in this tutorial. If we come here to the button and we say on click, and then we set that equal to add paragraph, and then we actually execute it within those parentheses, then that's going to register that click event as well. So there's 3 different ways that we can register a click event, but in this case I want to do it directly with JavaScript. So we'll go ahead and go with this one. This is a pretty simple one. But you might be asking, like, how do we know that that's an event that's valid? And the reason we know that is if we go to the event reference within the MDN web docs, this is going to give us all of the different events that we have for elements on the web. All right, so not all of these are going to work with, like, say, a button, but a lot of these will just work for various components within a web page. So here we have mouse events, and you can see the click event, and this is going to tell us that the event handler property is the on click, which is what we put in right here. So you'll get used to, you'll basically pick up on all of the common events with due time. There's only a few of them that are used on a frequent basis, and the on-click method is actually one of the most common events that you'll use in web programming. So at this point, we have our event wired up, and this add paragraph function is going to fire every time we click the button. So let's say the button is working, all right, and if we go ahead and open back up that console, so right-click, inspect, go to the console, and we're in the correct context, it looks like, and we can just say, or click the button, and it's going to say the button is working. And it's going to do it over and over again every time we click it. So the goal here is to insert a new paragraph element every time we click that button. right now it's just console logging a string to the console, but we can also construct a new element just like we did before. And this time around, I'm going to show you a few shortcuts that's going to make it a little bit easier to create this paragraph element. Now we want to have some random data to be printed to each new paragraph element, so I'll just generate a random number. We'll say random num is going to be equal to math.floor. This is a trick that we learned in a previous lesson, and we'll just do between 0 and 100, something like that. All right, and then we're going to say the p content. This is what we want to actually add within that paragraph element. We're going to combine this with the random number. We're just going to say the random number is, and then we're going to add via string concatenation that random number. All right, so now the p content is the random string, and let's go ahead and just test that out real quick by printing our random string to the console every time it is clicked. All right, so we will click me, and it's going to say the random number is 8. All right, so that's done. Now we need to actually create our paragraph element. The way that we do that is going to be, we're going to define a new element variable, and we're going to use the document.createNewElement method. All right, so if we go to the MDN docs, and we go to technologies, APIs, DOM, and then we go down to the document object right here, and then we go down to the methods. All right, so we're going down to the methods here in the documentation, and we should see a create element right here. So it's not create new element. I don't know why I said that here. We're just going to do create element, and then we need to pass in the type of element that we're looking for. So if we look at the create element documentation, it's going to say that our tag name is the only required property or parameter of this method. So any tag name works. In this case, we're going to pass in p for that tag name, and now we have a new element assigned to a variable. The next thing that we'll do is we're just going to, instead of creating a new text node like we did in that first example, we're just going to take the new element and we're going to use a property called text content which exists on it, and we're going to set that equal to the p content variable that we created prior. All right, so if we go to the documentation here and we go to, let's see, the element reference. So this is going to be of type element, and then the text content is going to be part of that. So really the fastest way to do this is just type text content, and it's going to be part of the node interface. So if you remember, the DOM tree is just constructed of a bunch of nodes, and no matter what type of node we're working with, it's always going to have the properties and methods of this node interface. So you can see in the properties, if we scroll down to text content, you can see that we can actually set this to new content directly. So we'll do that here. And now we just need to basically add this to the document at the very end. So the way that we do that is we come down here at the bottom, we say document.body.append child, and then we put in the new element which has our random text content. We'll get rid of this console.log here. All right, so here's the whole function that we're dealing with. So we have add paragraph, we get a random number, we generate random content from that number, we create a paragraph element, we assign the random content as the text content of that element, and then we append it to the end of the HTML body, which is basically going to be after this button. All right, so let's go ahead and test this out. So we press click me, and we're going to get a new paragraph element with a random number every time we click it. So it's pretty cool. Like this is where programming starts to get kind of fun, is when we actually can start building things that are interactive and we can click buttons and get results. So hopefully this brings you a little bit of excitement. Obviously it's not something useful, but we will soon get there in future videos. As you can see with some of the examples we've gone through, there's really only a few methods and properties that you kind of have to remember with the DOM. We got the query selectors, so how do we identify the element we want, and then the methods where we can create new elements and modify both their content, their attributes. We haven't talked too much about that yet, but we can do a bunch of stuff with these elements. So the next thing we have to talk about is going to be how do we navigate an HTML document. Now, I talked about the DOM tree and how there's, siblings and parents, grandparents, child, all that kind of stuff. And that's going to come into play here. How do we actually navigate through a complex HTML document? To do this, I'm going to copy in a predefined HTML document here that you'll see. We've looked at this before. And we're going to basically figure out how this DOM, all the DOM interfaces actually work here. When I talk about, DOM nodes and, elements and how elements kind of inherit from a DOM node, like what does that all mean? And that's going to become more apparent when we work through the navigation of this HTML document. So let's put that diagram back up on the screen where we can see this document right here visualized as a tree. And from this, this visual, you can see that these list items are going to be siblings, and they're going to be children of the unordered list. So how do we select this unordered list and then get all of the children of it with JavaScript? Well, this is actually simpler than you might think. So we've already been able to identify elements from the DOM. So we use document.querySelector, and then we pass in either a tag or an ID or a class name, something like that to identify it. Since we only have one unordered list in this entire document, we can just put in UL as the tag name, and that's going to, when we change the context here and try it again, that's going to select this list right here. Now let's go ahead and assign this to a variable so that we have something to work with. So we'll say our list is equal to document.querySelector, and then we're grabbing the actual HTML tag. So we press enter. Now we have a list, and that's going to be showing us the HTML here. Now obviously this is just a visual representation of the object, but if we wanted to figure out what is this variable representing? What does the list variable actually represent? We have a way of doing that. If you're ever confused what type of variable you're working with, you can use this handy property that every node in the DOM tree has. All right, so if we say list.nodeType, it's going to return us a number. All right, and we wonder, what is that number? Well, if we go to the documentation and we type in node.nodeType. So if you were to just type in node type, you can find this. And once you click on it and scroll down to the constants, so these type constants, this will tell you what type of element you're working with. So in this case, we got the value of 1. And that tells us that we're working with an element node. And from here, we can click element, and we can see, okay, this is the type of node within the DOM that we're working with, and here are the properties and methods that are available to us. So if we were to scroll down and look at the properties of the element, we see this property called children. All right, so if we click on that, it's going to say the parent node property children is a read-only property that returns a live HTML collection which contains all of the child elements of the node upon which it is called. All right, so let's go back to our document here, and we'll say list.children. And you can see that we're getting returned this HTML collection. Now from here, HTML collection is of course another thing that we don't understand, but we can once again go back to the documentation and click on HTML collection to see what we're dealing with. And from here we can once again go over to the methods and properties, and there's this one method called item on the HTML collection, which is going to return us the element at a specific index of that HTML collection. So basically like an array that we've worked with in JavaScript before, but it's not quite an array. You can't just come over here and pass in brackets and put in a 0 or a 1. At least I don't think. Maybe you can. I'm not sure. Okay, maybe you actually can do that. But if we put in list.children.item and we select 1, this is going to select the second item of the list. So this is the way that I've always done it, in the way that the documentation kind of presents it, but it looks like, at least in the browser I'm working in, the bracket notation works as well. From here though, we can identify specific elements within our list, and then we can set those equal to variables just like we did the list itself. So if we come over to the left and we say list item is equal to the second one in the list, and we press enter. Now we have that entire HTML element stored in a variable, and we can use different properties on it to modify it. So if we came over here and we said list item, which is representing that second item, and we said text content, all right, this is list item number 2, but we can set it equal to some new content, all right? So we did this already, but watch what happens in the HTML document. When I press enter, it changes the content. So this is just kind of showing you how you can, look at the whole DOM tree, and you can say, okay, here's the parent, and then I can get children, and then I can select one of the child elements of that, set of children, and then from there I have a standalone HTML element that I can do all sorts of things with. I can set event listeners on it, I can change the text content, and I can do all sorts of other things that are defined by the documentation that I'm working with. Now, once again, maybe we don't know what this list item represents. What is the node type of it? Well, all we have to do is say node type, and we get the answer of 1 once again, which means it is an element. And from there, we just go to the documentation. We can just go back up here and just search element, and then from here we have all of the properties, all of the methods, all of the event listeners that are available to this specific element that we have stored in a variable. All right, the next thing I want to do is I want to dig a little bit deeper into this concept of nodes. So I've been beating around the bush here a little bit, talking about how everything in the DOM tree is considered a node, but we've also been looking at elements and HTML collections and stuff like that. And it can get very confusing, like all of these different interfaces, what's going on here? Like, these are all different data types, they all have different properties and methods. How do I know where to look, what has what available to it, so on and so forth? Well, before I get into this, this is a object-oriented programming concept. And that's not something that we've covered yet. We may cover it in future videos, but this gets into things like classes and inheritance and class methods and static methods and all that kind of stuff. And the thing that I want you to recognize right now is that we have all these different interfaces defined by the DOM. All right, so at the very top, we have this thing called a node. So let's go back to the node. And what I want you to remember is that everything in the DOM inherits from this node interface. So everything below it, so an element or an HTML element interface, these all inherit up to this node interface, which basically means these elements have all of their own properties and methods, but they also have access to this, master node interface as well. So if we were to go look at some of the things we have available on this node, you can see this append child method that we've been using quite frequently. And let's see if we can find a couple other ones. It looks like that might be the only one that we've been using. But we also have text content, so we've been using that to modify the text within an HTML element. And we have node type, we've used that one before. Let's see what else. It looks like that's pretty much it, but you can see that this node has a bunch of properties and methods that are available to anything below it. So in other words, if we come back to our document here, our HTML document, and we know that we have this unordered list stored in the variable called list, all right? And we know that list, if we say list.nodeType, it is of type element, which inherits from that, node interface that basically defines every element. From here, all we have to do is we say list.appendChild, And that's going to be a valid method because it's part of the node interface as we just saw. And from here, we can insert an HTML element and actually add it to the end of this list. But first, we have to actually create that element, and this will be a good opportunity to show another method that we've already seen but didn't really dig into yet. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take list.append child, and I'm going to say document.new, create element, and we're going to make it a list item. And this is going to be completely empty, no content within it. And you can see that we have a new list item showing up at the end of this list. And all we have to do now is we say list.children, and we select the final element, we have to say item, and then we select the final element, and then we say text content, and we can put in some content here. And now we have added a new item to the end of the list and modified it. So you can see how we can start parsing through and navigating through this hierarchy pretty easily once we get the hang of it. Now what I want to introduce is something a little bit tricky, and this is where we really have to think when we're navigating through the DOM, because in this HTML document you can see that we have two P elements that don't have an ID and they don't have a class. And that basically means we have no way of identifying these in an easy, specific way. So the first way that we can, think about identifying one of these elements is by the query selector method. And what we're going to try to do here is basically insert another element between these two paragraph tags. And if you go to the documentation and you go to I believe it's the node. Let's see. Yeah, so the node interface has this method called insert before. And what that does is it basically inserts a HTML node or element that inherits from node before a specific reference element. So basically in our case, we're going to use this method, and we're going to have to figure out how do we identify this second P tag right here. Now the way that we would think about doing this is we say document.query selector, and then we grab anything that has a P tag, all right? And in this case, when we press enter, we're going to get the wrong one because the query selector method only gets the first occurrence. Now what we can do is we can change this to query selector all. And what this is going to return us is a node list. So unlike an HTML collection, which we got when we looked at the children of that unordered list, now we have just a node list, which is a slightly different data type. If we didn't know what this meant, we can just go back to the documentation and we can type in node list. And let's see what this does. All right, so node list objects are a collection of nodes usually returned by properties such as node.childNodes and methods such as document.querySelectorAll, which is what we used. And let's look at a few more things. We have some properties, we have the length of it, and then we have methods. So we have this method called item, similar to HTML collection, where we can select something with an index. So we can go ahead and do that, and we can actually just chain it to the end of this. So we'll say item, and then maybe we'll pass in item number 1. And that's going to get the first index, so remember it's 0 index, so the first P element will be 0, then the next one will be 1. So now we have selected the second element, and what we want to do is we want to assign that to a variable. So we'll say P element is equal to that, and now we want to use the P element. Let's first say node type, and we're going to get a type of 1, which means it's an element type, and we know that element is kind of like a child, or it inherits from that node type, which is the base class. So we're getting the node type, and so we know that the P element, or P elem, is going to have this insert before method. So let's go ahead and learn how do we use that. So if we go back to what we were looking at previously, so we've got node.insertBefore, Now let's look at the syntax. We learned about this in prior lessons, how to read this documentation. And what we're seeing here is that we have the parent node right here is going to be the parent of the newly inserted node. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the parent to the node that we're trying to insert? Let's go back to our HTML document, and maybe we can even pop up the diagram on the screen and see that what is the parent to an element that we insert between these two paragraph tags. In other words, what is the parent of one of these paragraph tags? Well, the answer is going to be the main body div. All right, so we need to pass in a reference to this main body div as that first parent node right here. So we know that we have to select that, and then we have to put in a new node, which is going to represent a new element that we create, and then finally a reference node. So the reference node, as we can see down here, is going to be the node or the element that our new one is going to be inserted before. Or we're going to insert it before this element, all right? So if this is null, then the new node is inserted at the end, but we don't care about that because it's not. So let's go back, and the first thing that we need to do is identify that parent. So we'll say parent is equal to document.querySelector, and then this time, since we have a class to select it by, we're going to select it with the class notation. So we have parent, we'll just check that we're getting the right one. And now we just have to say parent.insert before, all right? And then we have to make a new node. So the new node is going to be a P element. So let's go ahead and create that real quick. So, or actually no, we need to create a new element. So new P tag is going to be document.create element of type P, and then we're going to assign some text content. We'll say programmatically added between. All right, so now we have our new element, and finally we're going to take the parent, we're going to insert before, we're going to pass in the new element that we're putting there, and then we're going to reference the element that we want to insert it before. So that would be P lm. All right, so we did that up there before. So let's see if this works. And you can see that we have programmatically added this paragraph tag between these two paragraph tags right here. So this was a little bit of a tricky example, and we kind of ventured out into a method that we definitely had to read the documentation for before we knew how to use it. But this just goes to show how we can kind of navigate around the DOM by visualizing it as a tree and really understanding what's the parent, what's the child, what's the sibling, and what is the interface that I'm working with within the DOM. All right, if you are still watching this video, that's awesome. Most people are not going to make it through this kind of conversation about the document object model, but I will say that if you're at this point and you're very confused, that is totally okay. The purpose of this video and this crash course, especially this section about the document object model, is not to make you an expert at it. The purpose is to expose you to what it is, what are some of the things we can do with it, and just get you started and thinking independently of, okay, if I don't know something, how do I go figure it out? We went through a bunch of examples where I didn't necessarily know how to use these different methods, and I didn't know what type of data we're working with, but you go to the documentation, you search for it, and you figure it out. So if you're confused, that's totally okay. Keep moving forward. We're not going to actually be using the DOM all that much throughout the rest of the series, but as I said in the beginning, it's super important that you understand what it is, because it is at the root of every front-end framework that you're going to work with. If you start working in React, you're going to hear something called the virtual DOM. And if you don't know what the real DOM is, it's going to be very hard to understand what the virtual DOM is. And furthermore, if you're working with like Angular or Vue.js, these all connect in with this DOM API to basically expose their own API. So you're gonna have some easier ways of working with this HTML once we get into front-end frameworks, but underneath the surface, those frameworks are just connecting in with the same API that we just used in this video. So to do a huge recap of HTML, I think of it in two different parts. First is going to be the static HTML, and that's going to be just the HTML, like the stuff you see on the page here. This is static HTML, and no matter what you do, it's not going to change. All right. Now the next part is dynamic HTML, and that is what we see when we start working with the DOM and we start manipulating and adding, removing, changing, modifying, those kind of things with the existing static HTML. So there are two different parts. The first one's pretty simple, and I think you probably caught how to use it pretty easily, but the second one is very confusing, and even once you work with this for years, it's still going to be something that you're learning over and over and over again and perfecting along the way. But what I really want you to take away is that we can model an HTML document in a predictable way, and then we can write a specification called the document object model and allow JavaScript to connect in with that API to actually modify the static HTML. Now, the very last thing before we get into our lesson code challenge is going to be semantic HTML. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but when we first went through it at the beginning of this crash course, we were talking about the most simple elements possible. So we've got divs, we've got paragraph tags, images, inputs, list, all of those kind of things. With the new HTML5 spec, the new thinking on HTML is that, consistent with the concept that we want to use it for structure, we also want to use it for intent. So what do we intend to use these different elements for? Are we trying to section off a part of the web page? Are we trying to make a nav bar? Are we trying to make a footer? Normally you would just put all of this into div elements. So you can make a header and a nav bar and a blog section and a sidebar and a footer. You can make all of those things with just divs. But in the new HTML5 spec, it's you're basically supposed to plug into some of the new tags that they have available. And in this case, instead of using divs for all of these different features of your web page, you should be using a nav bar, so the nav tag. And for your section, so like the blog section, that should use a section tag, as well as the sidebar and stuff like that. And then you have this tag called main, which represents the main content of the page. And then you have an article tag, which might represent a single blog post. And then finally you have a footer tag, which obviously represents the footer. So all of these give more semantic, more meaning to the intent of how you're trying to use your HTML. And it's not super important for you starting out, but I want you to understand that it is out there, and when you see other people writing HTML and people that are really paying attention to best practices, you'll see those different elements pop up. But remember, you can always look at the documentation. If you ever have a question about a certain type of HTML tag, go to the documentation and type it into the search bar and read about it. That's the only way and the best way to learn as you're reading through other people's code. All right. This has been a pretty long HTML crash course, but unlike some shorter crash courses, I really wanted to walk you through my line of thinking and help you be more independent when thinking about HTML in the document object model. So hopefully this was informative, and now I have a challenge for you that's going to really test you. This is a tough one, but I'll go ahead and solve it with you on video after you've tried it yourself, and hopefully by doing so you're going to learn a lot about how do we reason through some of these different concepts, and how do we take our static HTML and make it dynamic and bring something to life. So what you see on the screen, I showed it to you before, but this is what we're going to create, where we basically have a random generator for memes and jokes and random quotes, and then riddles, so we can reveal the answer. And this will be a really cool project that I think you'll be excited to share with your network, and be sure to tag me on Twitter with it. 100 Days of Code is the hashtag that you want to use. But I'm really excited to dive into this. So in the next video, we're going to be solving it. But I recommend that you first try it on your own and see how far you can get. So the link to the Codepen starter pack is in the description. And what you're going to be working with is basically this right here. So let me go back to the starter portion. All right, so we have some code already written for you. So I've already put some buttons in here, and I've already linked up some of the events that are going to be called. And then I've made some template functions for you that are going to correspond to those click events. And then finally, I have all this random data down here, so a bunch of random quotes and meme URLs and stuff like that. And then I have a helper function called getRandomData, where in each of the methods that you're going to implement yourself, it's already grabbing a random piece of data that you just need to figure out how to put into the HTML document and display it in the right spot. Once again, I'm leaving a link in the description so you can go through and see like what are the user stories. So user stories are basically like what should a user be able to do when they're looking at this application. And so I've got those written out. I also have a few hints to help you out, just point you in the right direction on this. And then once you've tried it, watch the next video of this series and we will solve it together. If this video helped you, be sure to like and subscribe. It would really help me out. And I'll see you in the code channel.